Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. My name is Don Schiefelbein, who along with my father and mother, my 7 brothers, their wives, 32 grandchildren, and let's say about 30, as we know, great-grandchildren, operate Schiefelbein Farms, a large diversified farming operation in Kimball, Minnesota. I also have the opportunity to serve as a volunteer leadership role as the Vice President of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and as well, I am pleased to serve as the President of the American Angus Association through November. Tonight, I am pleased to kick off the Cattlemen's webinar 4-part series, focusing on beef cattle mineral nutrition. We are proud to be working with several industry leaders to bring you the latest on this topic. As a participant, your line will be muted, but feel free to type in questions in the question box on your screen during the webinar, and at the end of the presentations, we will get to as many of those as time will allow. If you have trouble with your technology, or if you are joining us only for the audio, the webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing in a few days at ncba.org. Just look for the producer tab on the website. Now I would like to thank our sponsor for this webinar, Multimin USA Incorporated. Now a few comments from Dr. Lawrence Havinga, CEO of Multimin USA. Dr. Havinga?
Thank you very much, Don. Good evening, everyone. As Don said, my name is Lawrence Havinga. I'm the CEO of Multimin USA. And on behalf of Multimin, I would like to thank you so much for having us here tonight and letting us be part of this webinar series. At Multimin, we're always happy to partner with NCBA for events like this to help circulate new information and up-to-date information to folks in the cattle industry. Cattle producers are the leading customers for Multimin, and we are really so appreciative of this partnership and really excited for all the good work ahead of us. The webinar tonight will feature Dr. Stephanie Hansen. Dr. Hansen is a professor in feedlot nutrition in the Department of Animal Science at Iowa State University. And really a major focus of our program is the refinement of mineral requirements to make mineral supplementation more strategic and get the most out of your animals. Dr. Hansen, the floor is yours.
All right. Hopefully everybody can hear me now. I think I'm unmuted. All right. So I want to start by saying thanks to Multimin for helping to support this webinar and to NCBA for having me here tonight. So I'm excited to talk with you guys from my home office, where I have been doing a lot of lecturing this spring and this fall again at Iowa State on my 2 favorite subjects, which are beef cattle and mineral nutrition. All right, so I had a little joke in my little intro that I had posted on the website that minerals are a complicated subject, but really they are. And so I wanted to start by just saying, why do minerals even matter? So this figure that you're seeing here on the right shows all the different things that minerals are involved in. So if you were to have a map in front of you of all of the biological processes that happens in your animal's body, and you threw a dart at that map, you couldn't manage to miss a mineral that supports one of those biological pathways. So minerals are critical in immune function, and we're going to hear more about that later in this series. Critical in growth, so both bone and muscle growth. Important in feed efficiency and how the animal is actually able to utilize energy. Affects things like marbling and ribeye area development, muscle fiber type. And then, of course, things like reproduction, which we'll also hear about later in this series. So on the other side of this figure, I've got what's called the mineral wheel. And this is a kind of a complicated little graph here that basically shows the minerals around the outside of that circle. And all those little lines interconnecting across the middle, those are places where these minerals affect each other. And sometimes that's a positive interaction, and sometimes that's a negative interaction. But really, when you're a mineral nutritionist like me, what that mineral wheel means is job security. And really that's because we're always learning more things about what minerals do in cattle and how we can continue to learn about them. And so that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay, so what do your cattle need for minerals? So we're going to start by breaking this down into the two categories of minerals. So on the left, we've got the macro minerals, and on the right, the trace minerals. So macro minerals are things that you're going to see in your ration as a percent of the diet. So you might think about crude protein as something that is, you know, your cow might require 10% crude protein in her diet. These minerals are in a percent of the diet, but in general, they're less than 1% of your diet. So they're super small, but super important components of your beef animal diet. So we've got them listed here: calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, and sulfur. And I just want to start by crossing off a couple of these that in general, for most of our beef cattle rations, we don't worry about having too little sulfur. In fact, we sometimes worry about the opposite. And we generally don't worry about being potassium deficient. And again, sometimes we worry about the opposite. There are, however, a few macros on here that we do really think about, and that is things like magnesium, phosphorus, and then sodium is going to be really important for driving mineral intake. So we're going to hint on each of these just a little bit, and then our speaker next time is going to talk about these more in depth. So for the macros, the body is able to store them in things like the bone, but they don't always have a quick way to recall them. So they kind of need to be in the diet in a constant supply. Luckily, a lot of our forages, for example, are going to provide these. On the other side of this graph, or this table, is the micronutrients, and so this is our trace mineral. So percent is parts per 100, and these micros are in parts per million. So very, very, very small amounts of the diet, and yet we can easily become deficient in these and negatively affect cow performance. So a whole bunch of minerals listed here that are the trace minerals that are in very small amounts in the body. A couple of the ones that in the beef industry we really think about a lot because our forages tend to be deficient in them are things like copper and zinc. Now, one of the cool things that the ruminant does is they're actually able to store some of these trace minerals, and so then they can have slightly more inconsistent intake and be able to actually utilize some of that storage later. I did also want to mention on here that iron is something that we generally do not need to concern ourselves with supplementing to most of our beef cattle, and that's because most of our forages or harvested feedstuffs are plenty high in iron, generally 2 to 3 times the amount the cow actually would need. And in fact, iron's an antagonist and will prevent the absorption of some of the other critical trace minerals listed on here, like manganese or copper. So I borrowed some data here from my friend Mary Janowski, who's a beef specialist at Nebraska. And this is a nice figure that just gives you an idea of how forage content, or forages, excuse me, can vary in mineral content. So this is looking at some meadow hay from the Sandhills Laboratory, and we're looking at hay harvested in June, so relatively early in the season, July, so a more mature cutting, and then the fall regrowth. And then over on the far right is what the NRC would say is the requirement for minerals for the different ones shown here. So the only real point I want to show on here from the macros on the top part of this slide is that some things like phosphorus are affected by maturity. So the phosphorus of your pasture is likely actually decreasing right now if your pasture looks like mine, which was, it was eyeball high 2 months ago, and now it's all brown. And so as it gets more mature, we actually get less phosphorus there. I really wanted to focus on the bottom part of this slide, and that is to show the trace minerals. So unlike energy, unlike crude protein, even unlike the macro minerals, the trace mineral content of forages can vary considerably. And we're going to talk about some of the factors that cause that in just a second. But I just wanted to show you on here that, again, relative to the requirement for iron shown here, our forages are going to be very adequate. But for things like manganese, we might be kind of borderline. And for forages, for zinc and copper, very consistently across the United States, the survey data would suggest that our forages are moderately deficient to severely deficient in things like zinc and copper. So those are important ones to keep in mind for your supplementation programs. All right, so why do minerals vary so much in forage? And so the first thing I want to say here is that if you're looking at a book value, so let's say you've got brome grass hay at whatever stage, and you're looking at the book value to try to get a guesstimate of what your mineral content is, you really want to take those averages with a grain of sodium chloride. Yeah, sorry, that's a bad mineral joke there. But those averages may not apply to you depending where your operation is. And that's because the soil conditions on your place are going to have a big influence in how much trace mineral actually gets taken up by the plant. So a great example of this is North Carolina. So eastern part of North Carolina, very sandy soils, tend to be selenium deficient. You get into the central part of the state in the Piedmont area, and it's got more loamy type soils, different pH. And then you get into the mountains in the western part of the state, super high in things like iron, more of a clay type soil, very different pH. All of those conditions will change how forages want to take up or are able to take up minerals. And the net effect of that is that when your cow consumes it, she's getting a different type of mineral composition with each mouthful. And those can vary based on different things, including drought conditions and others. So a lot of things can affect it. So if you're thinking about developing your own supplementation program that's kind of tailored to your operation, which is a great way to be cost effective, testing your own forages can be a really important part of that. Don't assume that the book averages apply to you. And just while it's on my mind here, make sure you test your water as well. Don't assume that water doesn't have antagonists like sulfur or iron or other things that might actually affect your mineral program. So I'm just going to make a couple of comments here on a couple of the macros, and then we're going to talk mostly about the trace minerals here. So making a note here on phosphorus and calcium. In general, when we think about pastures and most of our forages, they're generally going to be okay for calcium when it comes to gestating and lactating cow requirements. But phosphorus can be really variable. A great example of phosphorus variability is this great state of Nebraska. So eastern side of Nebraska, kind of like we are here in Iowa, probably okay for phosphorus, especially if you're applying manure that's come from corn-fed animals. You've probably got okay phosphorus in there. You get out into the sandhills in central and western Nebraska, much lower phosphorus and opportunities to run into phosphorus deficiency, and then you want to consider supplementing. Now, one of the things, if you think back to that mineral wheel where we started, is that calcium and phosphorus supplementation really need to be considered together. And that is because in the animal's body, same way as in ours, the metabolism of one of these affects the other. So we can run into things like phosphatic stones or other kind of problems with metabolism. And so the goal really is to have a minimum of a 1-to-1 ratio with these, sometimes even closer to 2-to-1, depending what type of beef animal you are feeding. So I know that these are all going to be things that probably our next speaker is going to talk about a little bit, so I'm kind of just hitting the highlights on these first few. The other one I wanted to talk about was grass tetany. And so grass tetany is a function of magnesium deficiency. And the point I want to make here is that the concentration of mineral in a diet does not always guarantee adequate status. So magnesium is a really great example of this. So if we look at this grass shown here, it would be like a cool season grass, so maybe something like brome grass. And you can see that we would have the yield kind of shown in this green curve. So the yield is highest in the spring, kind of in May, falls down in June and August, and then we might get some fall regrowth out here on the far right of that curve. The magnesium concentration of that forage is shown here kind of in this pinkish line, and it doesn't really change very much. So one of the misnomers is that cows get grass tetany in the spring because that grass is low in magnesium. That's not actually really true. The magnesium is fairly steady across the different stages of production of grass. What does change is this guy up here in the blue, and that's potassium. So spring, all that lush spring growth is very high in potassium, and potassium actually blocks the absorption of magnesium from the cow's rumen. So the cow isn't very good at mobilizing magnesium in response to low intakes, so she really needs to have it in the diet every day. And so that magnesium, when it normally would get absorbed from the rumen, she's fine, but when she consumes grass that's really high in potassium, all of a sudden it's blocking that route of absorption in the rumen, and now the magnesium can't be absorbed as well. So one of the ways to get around that is to feed high mag minerals, so things like magnesium oxide, which is actually pretty bitter. You need to think about some palatability drivers in there. And when you get a lot of magnesium in the diet because of those high mag minerals, there's actually another transporter that's able to move magnesium and help that cow absorb it and manage it. So unfortunately, it's not just potassium that blocks magnesium absorption, but if you fertilize this lush spring grass as well, nitrogen will also block that magnesium absorption. So it's kind of a 2-1 punch there. So our general goal is to have our forage, for example, have a ratio of potassium to magnesium of about 10-1 or less. So in the spring, when you've got potassium that's 2 to 3% of that grass, you definitely need to have a high mag mineral. I wanted to make a comment here. I get questions about this a lot when I give talks about whether cows are able to balance their own diet, basically. So the short answer is no. As great as that would be, right, that she could just, pick what she needs. There's no evidence that cattle or mammals can actually balance their own diet. So they don't really have any of this nutritional wisdom. And in fact, there's evidence that animals will select the diet that tastes really good, but is really not very good for them, even to the point of death. And so really the issue here is that it's palatability and not a demand for cobalt or a demand for zinc that's the factor that's driving mineral consumption. And so we know that we can change the amount of salt that's in a pre-choice mineral, and that will really drive intake. And I know that's going to be a big focus on the consumption lecture next time. My best analogy from the human side of things is if you picture yourself sitting in front of the Super Bowl game and you've got 2 bowls in front of you. One is full of nice green broccoli and all those lovely B vitamins, and the other one is full of pretzels. And admit it, none of you reached for the broccoli. So you went for the salty food, right? And so that's the same thing that your cows are doing. They're driven by that salt intake. So I actually pulled this slide from a presentation I had given to some of our Iowa Beef Center field staff a few years ago, and I had pulled them before the meeting and said, what are the things that you guys want to know about minerals? And this was one of the questions that a lot of them had, and that was even just when to ask this question of when might we be running into a deficiency of minerals and what's our problem? So I just picked a handful of examples here. If you have heard that traditionally has had really good pregnancy rates, and then all of a sudden you're running into some issues where the pregnancy rates are lower than expected, and you can't tie it back to a bull that failed his BSE or a heat stress event or AI tank failure or something like that. These trace minerals are certainly important in reproduction. So things like copper, manganese, and zinc all play roles in conception and maintenance of pregnancy. So those could be targets to look at if you suspect your pregnancy rates might be due to mineral problems. Classic selenium deficiency, if you are having issues with retained placenta, we could put vitamin E in that category as well. Weak or newborn calves, they kind of call these the dumb calves that don't want to, they don't want to suck. They're not very thrifty when they're born. That can be selenium or vitamin E deficiencies, vitamin A deficiencies, or even iodine. Iodine is important in temperature regulation in the animal, so especially like in cold weather. You get this question a lot about copper deficiency, right? So if you have around the muzzle, the eyes, or the ears where the hair is particularly thin, you get that graying of the hair or discoloration, depending what their base color normally is. That can be copper deficiency, certainly when it gets extreme. But keep in mind that unfortunately, cows aren't running around with a flag that says, hey, I'm copper deficient or I'm zinc deficient. It's actually one of the biggest challenges with mineral nutrition, that sometimes it's very hard to diagnose the problem. So if you see discoloration, in the spring, it could be shedding out and have nothing to do with copper. It could be sun bleaching. And so it's maybe not always just a jump to copper. But if you analyze your diet and it's low in copper, then maybe that's a reasonable assumption. And then the last one here, basically all these minerals are important in growth, so that's not a very good indicator. But if you know that you live in an area where the soils are deficient, then it's likely that your feedstuffs are deficient. A good example of this is in Iowa, the eastern side of the state is relatively low in selenium, so they know they need to supplement. The western side of the state, where I'm from originally, we didn't have to worry about that because we had adequate selenium. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about supplementation strategies. So there's really a few main ways to think about getting mineral into the animal from a dietary strategy, and then we'll talk about some others as well here. So I'm a feedlot nutritionist, right? So I have the good life compared to worrying about cows eating mineral. I'm just going to make a balanced diet for my cattle in the feedlot, and I'm going to hope that they eat it out of the bunk so that every mouthful is a nice, complete, balanced ration. So that is really the easiest way to assure consistent intakes and supplement the diet in his TMR. If you have backgrounding operation, considering adding the minerals in as a part of the supplement, so part of a corn or a distillers-based supplement instead of just as free choice. And then from a free choice perspective, we know that minerals are obviously provided like that as well. That's what our next speaker is going to talk about. And the biggest challenge with free choice minerals is that intake varies considerably. You've got the boss cow who's up there all the time. You've got the less dominant cow who maybe doesn't get up there and push in. You know, you need to think about how many feeders you offer. There can just be a lot of considerations there. So I just want to make this other comment here. My grad students would joke that this is my favorite saying, and that is that no mineral is an island. And I teach that to them so that they are ingrained with this idea that you can't ever just try to fix one problem. Because if you come in and supplement a bunch of zinc, you now might throw copper into imbalance. So you've always got to kind of take a holistic approach when thinking about coming in with a supplementation program. Okay, so one of the questions I get all the time, and I wanted to make sure we addressed tonight, was how to compare these different sources. So we like to use this big word, bioavailability. So what the heck does bioavailability mean? So bioavailability of a mineral is basically going to be how much of that mineral the animal is actually going to absorb and be able to use for some process, whether that's growth or reproduction or milk production or antioxidant defense, whatever they're going to do with it. The bioavailability is kind of going to separate our sources for us here. So when we think about dietary sources, these are really the three main categories that you might see on a tag or otherwise for formulation. The first one is kind of our classic inorganic sources. Inorganic sources are those things that we mine straight from the earth. It's copper sulfate, zinc sulfate, calcium carbonate, things like that. In general, these are going to be the cheaper of your sources for minerals, and almost always they're very highly soluble in water. There's a few exceptions, but in general, they're very highly soluble in water. Now, the pH of water and the pH of the rumen are pretty darn similar. pH in the rumen is going to be a little more acidic, and so if it's soluble in water, it's soluble in the rumen. Now, that may or may not be a good thing, and we'll come back to that in a second. The next one that you probably hear a lot about is organic or chelated or complex sources. And in general, that's going to be a mineral that we've had some magic chemistry happen to it. And now instead of being, say, zinc bound to sulfate, it might be zinc bound to an amino acid like methionine or a polysaccharide or something else. And so that's what we call this ligand. It's something that's holding on to that mineral. And you can kind of think of those two as having a really tight friendship. So that zinc and that methionine, they want to stick together. And that can be a good thing because that could mean that that zinc's not going to wander off and find a new friend like a piece of fiber to bind to and then never be available for absorption by the GI tract of that animal. So the theory is that organic sources should be more bioavailable than inorganic because they're protecting against some of these unwanted interactions in the gut. The last one is the hydroxy sources, and those are currently available as copper, zinc, or manganese. And their chemistry is a little different, so they're not bound to an amino acid or something like that, but they're actually bound to hydroxyl groups. And because of that chemistry, they're super insoluble in water. So they don't go into solution in the rumen, but they do go into solution in the stomach or the abomasum in the ruminant, and then should be available for absorption in the small intestine, because all these minerals that we're talking about, with the exception of magnesium, are all going to be absorbed in the intestine. So that's where we want them to be available. Okay, so Jesse, if you want to drop this website in the chat now or later, that would be great. I wanted to make a reference to this website for the audience because I think it's a really nice producer-oriented fact sheet that Casey Olson put together when he was with University of Missouri Extension several years ago. This has been updated recently, but in general, this does a really nice job of talking about mineral in feedstuffs, mineral requirements of cattle, and then it has this section on bioavailability. So I just pulled out this section on copper for us to talk about here tonight. So this is some of the different copper sources that might be available that you might see in a tag or somebody might help you formulate in your ration. This is what the math looks like, the chemistry formula. This is the percent of the mineral. So for example, copper sulfate is not 100% copper. It's actually just 25% of copper sulfate is copper. And then this last column is what we're going to talk about, and this is relative bioavailability. So we said bioavailability is that which gets absorbed and the animal can actually use. And in this case, copper sulfate is kind of our gold standard used by the industry. So we're going to force it to be equal to 100%. Now, that does not mean that copper sulfate is 100% available to your ruminant. It does mean that it's going to be forced to be set to 100%. And so all the rest of these things can be compared to it. Is it less than copper sulfate or is it better than copper sulfate? So I really just want to pick on a couple of these things here. One of them is the two that I have red boxes around are both inorganic copper sources. And you can see that copper oxide is only 15% relative bioavailability compared to copper sulfate. So copper oxide is not very available to your animal. It would not be the major source of copper that you would like to see on a mineral tag, for example. But then things like the hydroxy copper here, shown as tribasic copper, is a little more bioavailable than copper sulfate. Copper lysine in this case was pretty similar. These are some older data too, and there's newer studies since then, and this is certainly not an all-inclusive list. We don't have the glycines or things like that on here, but just a great resource if you're interested in how to compare some of the different sources. So I mentioned that the hydroxy sources were not soluble in the rumen, so I just wanted to show you a little bit of data about what I'm talking about there. So Olivia Genther, when she was a PhD in my lab several years ago, fed ruminally fish-chelated steers diets that either had no supplemental trace mineral, had low amounts of copper that came from inorganic copper sulfate, had low amounts of copper that came from the hydroxy copper, or had high amounts of copper from copper sulfate, or high amounts from the hydroxy copper. And essentially, this is looking at ruminally soluble copper. So we went in and took a rumen fluid, looked at how much copper was soluble in there. And if we look at it relative to our control treatment, which did not have supplemental copper in it, it's very low soluble copper. Basically, our low metal hydroxys here are not different statistically, so very low amounts of soluble copper. And similarly, not a whole lot higher here, even when we had higher amounts of copper from the hydroxy source. But both of our sulfates are higher. And this is just an example that sulfates, the inorganics, tend to be very soluble in the rumen, and the hydroxys are not very soluble in the rumen. So the reason that that might be interesting for something like copper is because one of the major antagonists that occurs in the rumen is this interaction between copper and sulfur and molybdenum, and that occurs in the rumen. So just a graph here from the state of Idaho, giving you an example. States out west tend to have relatively high molybdenum in their forages, although as this graph shows, you can have tremendous variability across the state. Molybdenum by itself is not a massive problem, but molybdenum plus a little bit of sulfur forms this complex that we'll talk about in just a second called thiolmolybdates, and it has a really high affinity for copper. So molybdenum plus a little bit of sulfur from water or feed can equal a major copper antagonist problem. And so copper supplementation becomes a really important consideration when you're in places like, say, Idaho here that has quite a bit of high moly forage. So the reason that happens is actually because your ruminant has a rumen, which is what makes them so great, right? They're this upcycler and can take advantage of all these poor quality feeds that us poor monogastrics can't use. But it is something that really puts us at a disadvantage when it comes to copper metabolism. So this is a diagram of a rumen, and we're showing when the animal has sulfate, either from water or from maybe like distiller's grains, another source of sulfur. And then we might have some high molybdenum that comes in, say, from forages would be our general place where molybdenum would come from, although there can be high moly water from like mining locations. And then in the reducing environment in the rumen, Basically what happens is that oxygen and sulfur have super similar chemistry. They're very close to each other on the periodic table. And so basically what happens is that sulfur replaces the oxygen in this molybdate equation, and we get this complex right here called thiomolybdate. Thiomolybdates will then have this friendly relationship with copper. They bind up that copper and they never let it go. They won't release it all the way until it ends up in the feces of this animal. So if you have a highly soluble copper source and you have sulfur and molybdenum that you know you have problems with in your diet, they're all mixing together here in the rumen and potentially decreasing the copper status of this ruminant. So that's just an interesting point of why some of the things like the hydroxys might be a cool option, because they're not getting exposed to that. Okay, I want to just talk a little bit here about trace mineral metabolism in general. So when your animal consumes dietary trace minerals, again, they're going to have to interact with some of these antagonists like molybdenum or others in the rumen, and then either be excreted or have relatively low rates of absorption. So trace minerals are only absorbed at about 5 to 20% of what you feed. So even though you're feeding 10 parts per million of copper, only a small fraction of that's actually being absorbed and ending up in the liver, where it can be stored or utilized or excreted. And this is why, as a nutritionist, I prefer to have a liver sample to try to understand the status of my ruminant, because the plasma concentrations might be very low and not very indicative of adequacy or deficiency. But this liver is where it's stored, and if I can get in there and see what's home in the liver, that's a much better indice for me in terms of what that animal's status is. So if you have the opportunity to work with a vet to do some liver biopsies on your herd, just some sampler animals, or you can get liver samples back from slaughter or from cull animals that go in, that can be a really great way to get a snapshot of what your mineral status of your herd looks like. Okay, so those are really all the dietary side, but one of the interesting things that the ruminant is able to do, as I alluded to earlier, is actually to store some of these trace minerals. So there's a different option to also supplement trace minerals here that the monogastrics are not able to use, and that is things like injectable minerals. So Multimin 90 is going to be given via a subcutaneous injection, and the nice thing about this is that all those gut antagonists that we just talked about, say copper having to battle through to get absorbed, if you do an injection, it goes straight into the bloodstream and you don't have to worry about those antagonists. So Multimin 90 is going to have 4 of our trace minerals of interest: zinc, manganese, copper, and selenium. And in this case, so in contrast to the mineral that got consumed by the diet, this one's going to go in via the needle. So you need to pay close attention to dosages, pay attention to what you're putting in there. And it's actually going to go straight to the plasma, and then very quickly, within a day or less, actually get taken up by the liver. So once it gets to the liver, it can either be stored and doled out for use later, which is the cool thing about ruminants that monogastrics don't really do very well, or they can utilize it right now if they're deficient or have need for it, or if they don't have need for it, they'll excrete it. Okay, so some of the advantages of using injectable is that you know the animal got it, you gave them a consistent dose, you didn't have to worry about consumption of free choice mineral, for example, and if you've got antagonists in the diet, you didn't have to worry about low absorption rates. Of course, the disadvantage is that it goes in through the needle, meaning you need to fit it into when you process cattle. So we do liver biopsies pretty routinely at Iowa State. This is a couple of my former PhD students, Dr. Dieters here in the Iowa State shirt, and Dr. Carmichael Wyatt, who now works for ADM, here in the dark sweatshirt. And these ladies were doing some liver biopsies. We actually use a bone marrow biopsy probe to do this, and we get these nice pretty little pieces of liver as shown here. The nice thing about this, if you work with your vet, they'll use a little bit smaller probe, fairly low stress on the animal. We use lidocaine before we go in and everything, and you can get a great mineral profile just out of a relatively small sample. Okay, I just pulled this slide from one of our previous studies. So most of the data I'm going to show tonight are all published, so you can Google us or look it up on things online, or look at our animal industry reports for a lot of these on our Iowa State Beef Center website. I picked this graph because it was a study where we looked at 3 different routes of trace mineral supplementation. So this was a study with some red Angus steers from a ranch in Nebraska, where we had fed them some different diets for 90 days prior to the start of this trial. And then we wanted to come in and do one of 3 different trace mineral strategies and see how it affected mineral concentrations in the liver. So I'm just showing copper here as an example. So we gave these steers one of 3 different diets. So either they got diets that were inorganic only, and we fed them at 150% of what the NRC says. So for copper, the NRC recommends 10, so we would have fed 15 parts per million here. And that was all from inorganic sources. So that's shown in yellow. In the black was our injectable trace mineral treatment, and that was Multimin 90 plus minerals fed all from inorganic sources at 100% of the NRC, so just what they require. And then in the red is this blend, and that is a match to the inorganic treatment, and that's 150% of mineral from NRC. But we did this blend that's kind of common in the industry. 75% of it came from inorganic trace minerals, and 25% came from organic. Now, our organics in that case were Avela copper, zinc, and manganese, and Cellplex selenium. Okay, this graph is based on liver biopsies taken on day 0, 14, 28, and 42 days after we either gave injections at the start or they started on these repletion diets. So basically what you can see is that if the animals got the injectable trace mineral as shown here in the black line, the liver copper increases very quickly. So we add about 50 parts per million of liver copper, which is pretty consistent with our other Multimin research. Of course, this would have been present if we had done a biopsy on day 1, right? It's not that it took until day 14 to increase. It increased within a day of giving that injection. And we know that from our previous work, but day 14 was our first time point in this study. So that increase stays out through day 28 and then kind of stays steady out through day 42. The red line is our blend treatment. And on day 14, both our blend and inorganic are less than the Multimin treatment. But by day 28, our blend treatment has now caught up to Multimin. So it took an extra 2 weeks, but they come to the same point together here on day 28. And that's a function of the fact that some of those organics that are in there are more bioavailable than the inorganics we were using. So the inorganics still down here. The interesting thing here is that if we just waited till day 42, all of these treatments came together. So I think it's a good example to show you how quickly the injectable gets to the liver, how the organic blends can help you to gradually get there, and how the inorganics are going to take the longest. But you would also want to look at performance and cost comparisons in here. Okay, so what are some of the time points that we think minerals are really important for the ruminant? Really, that's in particular going to be stressful time points. So we think about things like weaning or shipping, reproduction, mounting an immune response, and these last 2 are points that are going to be extensively talked about later in our series. So I'm really just going to talk about kind of this first point in our time here tonight. So one of the things that I'm really interested in, and my group is interested in at Iowa State, is how the beef animal responds to transit stress and how we can better prepare that animal to deal with transit stress so that they really get off the truck and have the best experience, say, in the feed yard or at the stocker operation, wherever they're going, or on the range if you're moving cows. So we did a study where we took steers, and for 90 days, we gave half of them a mineral deficient diet and half of them a mineral adequate diet. So we were trying to create 2 different statuses, kind of some mild deficiency or adequate steers here. Then we put them all in the truck, drove them around the state of Iowa for 16 hours because Dr. Hansen forgot to get health papers. And Dr. Hansen does this every time she does a transit study. So now the truckers just know they're going to drive around the state of Iowa because they can't leave the borders. So our steers have been driven around the state of Iowa in July for 16 hours. Of course, it was one of this type of weeks of July. It was like 105 degrees that week. Steers get unloaded. And then within our steers that got deficient or adequate diets, we further split them into either getting a Multimin injection or a saline injection. So the saline won't have any mineral. It's just to get the needle kind of exposure. And then we kept these animals through 90 days of a finishing period and harvested them out here. Took a bunch of blood and liver samples throughout to try to get an idea of what was happening from this mineral that came from the injection. Okay, so the first thing, is still one of the coolest studies I think that we've done, is that if those animals had mineral adequacy, so trace mineral adequacy based on supplementation, they had less body weight loss during the shipping event than if they were mineral deficient. Now these numbers look kind of weird because it's not just trucking, it's not just shrink. We weighed them a couple of days before trucking and a couple of days after trucking and kind of looked at that period of time in there. I think it's like 5 days long. But basically, if they were trace mineral deficient, they didn't do as well. And so this is another good indicator that minerals are just really important in the stress response. So what happened to the mineral that came from the injection? So this is showing out through 90 days post-injection. We're basically in the blue line, looking at liver copper here. Multimin animals shown in the blue line have greater liver copper statistically out through day 30. And it's really around day 60 that they start to come together with our saline treatments. So in general, in our studies, we've seen that the multimin increases liver copper and similarly liver selenium through at least day 30, usually out to maybe day like 45 to 60. And then certainly by day 90, they've come back together with baseline. So that's kind of a good estimate for you to keep in mind. Okay, so we know that the mineral from the injection was increasing liver. Did it do anything for performance? This is looking at that 90-day finishing period performance. And essentially, if the animals had been on the trace mineral adequate diet and they got saline or multimin, there was no difference in finishing period average daily gain for that 90-day period. But these animals that were just mildly trace mineral deficient, when we gave them multimin, we had a nice statistical increase. I don't know where my p-value is, but this p-value is 0.03. Nice statistical increase in average daily gain, and a little bit actually of a bump over the controls, which is kind of this like compensatory mineral response that we've seen in a couple of studies where when you've been deficient and we correct the problem, we actually get a little bit of a boost there. I think we had some improved ribeye and marbling in those animals as well. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up my last few minutes here, talk a little bit about some of the latest and greatest research that we've got going on at Iowa State. If you're ever in Ames, give us a shout. We'll be happy to take you around on a tour. Today it might be with a mask, but maybe that'll change in the future. So this is actually our feedlot. So we have 60 small pens of 6 head here in what we call the Long Barn. That's our working facility down in Story County, and we like to joke that pen 60 is in Boone County because it's a long hike to that working facility on a cold winter day. But these are some new calves that just come in, kind of chilling there, enjoying the nice October day in this picture. So one of the things we're really interested in my group is what does today's modern calf need for minerals? And that is a function of the fact that when I look at pictures of my grandpa showing cattle in the 50s, we had belt buckle cattle, and my aunt's showing cattle in the 80s or 70s, it was the big old Charolais with lots of frame. And now we've got kind of something in the middle, right? So cattle's lifetime average daily gain is almost 50% greater today than it was in the 1970s. And so we really just don't have a great appreciation for how that might change what the mineral requirements are for today's animal. So I'm just going to show a couple of pieces of data here. And the first one is to make a point here as well. So this is a study published in Applied Animal Science, Emma Niedermeyer's master's work with us, where we had a control diet that we did not supplement with trace minerals. And all these things in parentheses are the actual mineral concentrations of that ration. And it's okay if you don't know what those numbers should be. Just note this thing right here, which is basically like corn and corn co-product diets are in general deficient in all the trace minerals. They're just not adequate if we don't add supplement to them. These are what the NRC would recommend for concentration. So we did a study where we had no supplemental trace mineral. We added what the NRC would recommend, all from inorganics, and we added what the industry is doing based on the survey published a few years ago, which is basically 2 to 3 times what the NRC recommends. Again, all from inorganics. The only piece of data I'm going to show you from that is this, which I think is super interesting. And that is that in a study where we did not implant cattle, so these first 3 bars are not implanted, and then the next 3 bars were all implanted with an IS followed by a component TES, or TE200, excuse me. Basically what we see is that the non-implanted cattle are not profitable, and we actually don't even get into profit if we look at these red numbers up here. These are all losses. We don't even get into profitability in these cattle until we implanted them and we at least fed them what the NRC recommended. And if we fed them what the industry says that they're doing, we had even greater profitability. So we think this is super interesting, and we've been trying to do some follow-up to really figure out, what is it about these minerals that might be adding this extra hot carcass weight that added this extra profitability. And one of the things that we have noted in several of our studies now is that if you implant cattle, you decrease plasma zinc. And first off, it's hard to change plasma zinc. It is a bugger to move. It just doesn't move very much. And we are consistently seeing, like in this study shown here, where when we implanted cattle, relative to those that were not implanted, shown in the solid line, those that were implanted decreased plasma zinc within 13 days of that implant, and they maintained that through the rest of this 73-day study. So implanting cattle is causing them to grow faster. We know zinc is important for growth and nitrogen metabolism, and so we think that they are pulling that zinc to support that growth. That's similar to our ractopamine work, where, as shown here, when we fed cattle ractopamine, shown in the red bars, and this is increasing amounts of zinc from the left to the right of this graph, we basically linearly increased average daily gain of cattle during the ractopamine feeding period when we increased zinc. This would have been from a combination of inorganic zinc sulfate and organic Avelo-Zinc from Zinpro in this study, and all these cattle that were in the red bars were fed ractopamine at 300 mg per head per day. We've seen this in a couple of studies, and so we are convinced that there is an interaction happening between growth promoting technologies and zinc that would suggest zinc's really important for the ability of these growing animals to capture that muscle and capture that growth. And so this is a balanced study Remy Carmichael did during her PhD work, where she showed that if you fed ractopamine to steers, they increased nitrogen retention or protein or muscle accretion. But if you fed them zinc and zinc plus ractopamine, you improve that even further. And there's this really nice relationship between zinc and nitrogen retention, where we know that as we increase nitrogen retention, we're increasing the need for zinc to capture that. Now, one of the things that you might think, based on these graphs I've showed you so far, is that all minerals must be fed at greater levels than what we're doing right now, and more is always better. So I want to show you some data to say that that's not universally the case with minerals. I do think with zinc, we probably need to be feeding some more. But copper is a really great example where I think what the NRC recommends right now is spot on. So I'm just going to show these last couple of graphs and we'll be done here. And that is that copper seems to affect the ractopamine response in a very different way than zinc does. So remember, more zinc, more growth in the ractopamine response. And in this case, we actually see that if animals had adequate copper status and were fed at what the NRC would recommend, which would be 10 parts per million of copper, from both of these yellow bars here, that basically, this is from Avelo copper, we basically see that we had a 22% average daily gain response to ractopamine. So a really nice ractopamine response when they had adequate copper. But when we get too much copper, we have a lesser response, only an 8% improvement in average daily gain. And when they were copper deficient, there was no response, which is sort of fascinating. It makes me wonder how often things like mineral status are explaining why some cattle respond to certain technologies and some do not. We've also seen this in implant response, and this is a study where cattle either got no implant or got a aggressive or a potent implant, TE200, and they either got no supplemental copper, shown in the gray, or they got 20 parts per million of copper from copper sulfate, shown in the red. And essentially what you see is that the average daily gain increase due to implant is about 25% within the copper controls, the no supplemental copper treatment, and it's only 15% when we added that extra copper. So we kind of think that high industry level of copper, 20 parts per million, is too high, and we need to be closer to what the NRC recommends. Okay, so based on some of our work at Iowa State, we think that cattle that grow fast especially need more zinc than currently recommended, but the copper requirement is probably pretty close, and actually too much copper is definitely detrimental to performance. Overall, minerals are going to be critical for supporting growth, health, and reproduction of beef cattle. So just want to leave this with this final comment. So test your feed, test your water, and start a conversation with your nutritionist or your extension specialist to see how being strategic with mineral supplementation can help you optimize your ranch's operations. And with that, I will be happy to take any questions. There's my Instagram handle, my email, and my office phone number. Not that I'm there anymore because we all work from home these days, but I'll get your message. So what questions do you have?
Thank you very much to all the attendees for joining us for tonight's presentation. I think the partnership between Multimin and the NCBA is truly about bringing the latest relevant information to cattle producers. And Dr. Hansen, I really want to thank you for definitely helping us achieving that goal tonight. So as we move into our question and answer session, please remember to type your questions into the question chat box. And yeah, I think now let's get to the questions. Thank you very much again for participating in the webinar tonight. And I'm going to hand it over to Jesse Fulton, the Director of Producer Education with NCBA, to moderate tonight's question and answer. Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you, Dr. Hansen. Great presentation. I was trying to scribble questions as fast as I could in notes, but as I was scribbling them, you were answering them. So, but one question I did have goes back to your Ginther-Hansen paper of 2014. I was going to ask, would it be ideal to give multi-min prior to extreme stress to try to reduce sickness? And you kind of showed how, given multi-min would help the animals out. But did you all track sickness and morbidity in that paper?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's actually one of the big questions we have when it comes to stress, right? Is it something we should try to get in front of and improve their status before, say, a trucking event or things like that? Or is it something that we just have to realize the problem might show up at our doorstep, and we got to deal with it when it gets there? That was not probably a big enough study to really look at the health and morbidity. I will say that one of the things that was interesting in that study was that we could track. So since those steers were at Iowa State before we trucked them, we knew what each individual steer was eating before he left, and we knew what he was eating when he came back. And the animals that were adequate, or the animals that got multi-min off that truck, because of that improvement in mineral status, they recovered their feed intake more quickly, which I've always thought was a super cool finding from that study. And I really do think that, the stress affects intake and things like that. So there's a lot more to learn about that. There's other bigger pen studies that have looked at some of the health stuff, but so we wouldn't have had enough animals for that. But I do definitely think there's a stress and maybe an intake response there.
I see. I actually cited that paper for my thesis when I was in grad school. So great. It was a great paper. I encourage everybody to go read it. We have a great question from someone who has Forage where it provides 80% of the trace mineral requirement. They want to know, what extent would you use free choice mineral to fit the gap? If it meets the 80%, would you go 20% or more?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have this rule, and it's one of those rules where nobody knows where it came from, and everybody just keeps citing it, so it's become a rule. And that is that we tend to assume that only about half of the mineral that's in that forage is actually available to the animal. So let's say that there was 20 parts per million of manganese in there, that maybe only about 10 parts per million of that was actually available, whether that's because it's not as digestible, or forage maturity, or antagonists, or other things. So I think that's a good rule of thumb. So if you figured out that basically you could meet about 80% of their needs, but maybe it's really only about 40% of their needs, and then try to make sure you have a mineral that kind of balances that. Especially look at some of your particulars. So if it's something like copper that's in particular low, or if you have antagonists, like it's high in iron or high in molybdenum, you might want to think about, being strategic. Maybe you just have a little more copper, but maybe you don't need as much manganese. So I think that's the thing where nutritionists and extension specialists can help you kind of formulate some custom mineral. So hopefully that helps. That's a great question. It's a very common question.
Great. Multi-min 90, the injectable mineral, is becoming really popular, and a lot of producers are using them. When is the best time to use multi-min 90 on our beef cattle operations?
Yeah, so I always tell people that if I had to pick one time to put multi-min in the beef system, I would give it to the cow, and I would give it to her, if possible, 6 to 8 weeks before calving. And the reason I like that timing is that I think it's a little bit of a 2-for-1. Like maybe you're giving a scours vaccine or something at that time. So in the last third of gestation, that fetal liver is accumulating trace mineral that will basically meet his mineral needs for basically his first 3 to 6 months of age. So beef cow milk, actually all milk, is super low in trace minerals. So when that calf is born, he is not getting his trace minerals from mom's milk. He is getting them from pulling his own liver stores, and he got those liver stores during gestation from mama. So mama needs to have a good mineral program, especially during gestation, to be able to support that liver mineral accumulation. So if you can get in there with an injection, you're say 6 to 8 weeks before calving, you're getting her a boost in liver mineral stores. That can be translated to the fetus, and that helps him get kind of a better jump start. The other one is, and I think there needs to be more research on this, but I did my master's in reproduction as well as nutrition, and I've always been fascinated by some of the data, both from Brazil and from the US, where timing of multi-min along with synchronization programs, when you're getting into AI, sometimes I think there's some things to be worked on the timing, but I think there's something really cool happening there. And we know that things like zinc, for example, are really important in conception. So I think that timing around like breeding or setting up for timed AI would be the second choice for me, I guess.
All right. Yeah, I've definitely heard of giving multi-min just prior to AI, so great point. You talked about implants. I'm going to switch over to the feed yard guys for a second. You talked about implants pulling down the zinc plasma, also ractopamine. How much more additional zinc do you need to feed to try to counterbalance that and try to keep their zinc plasma levels high?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's actually one that we're starting to get an answer for. So that's fun. It's always nice when you can actually answer questions. So in the study that I showed where we decreased plasma zinc when we implanted cattle, we added what the NRC would recommend for zinc. So we had about 30 parts per million that would have just been in the diet from our corn-based diet. And then we added 30 parts per million to that. So that total diet was about 60 parts per million. And we're still getting that drop down in plasma zinc. In studies we've done in the last year or two, when we've fed 100 parts per million of zinc, we still see that plasma zinc drop, but not to as much of a degree. And we just did a study hot off the presses this past spring, where we went all the way up to 150 parts per million of zinc, and we saw some really nice performance responses. We do not have the plasma zinc analyzed from that yet. Mr. Smith, if you're listening, you can get busy on that next week. So I think that if I had to pick, I'd like to be somewhere in that 90 to 100 parts per million. But I think eventually we're going to learn that we might be able to be strategic with even a little bit more with the right timing.
All right. Here's another great question where someone is using free choice mineral and multi-min, both around calving. So their intake of their the intake of their free choice mineral is not very consistent. Sometimes they can't put out enough mineral, and then some days very little is consumed over a 30-day period. Any idea what might be happening to cause that change? I know Steve will get to that next week a little bit, but do you mind touching on that a little?
Sure. So there's a couple of things. Part of it is just, when cows get put out to pasture, boy, there are just more interesting things to do, right, than to go check out that mineral. So when you have times when the mineral intake is low, think about moving it closer to the water, kind of their loafing areas. If anything, they'll check it out more because they're hanging out in the area while they're waiting for access to the water tank or whatever, or they'll hit the mineral feeder and then go get a drink and go back. In times where it's too high, sometimes that's okay when they're first doing that. They're kind of just, getting that taste back again. One of the big things Steve, I think, is going to talk about is how you can blend salt in different levels to really drive that intake and try to control it. But I would say kudos to the producer who asked the question for the fact that you're even monitoring intake. That is the first step to know whether or not you've got an issue, right? So even if it's just keeping something in the truck and you write down the date and how many bags you put out, and the next time that you check and you find it's empty, you write that down, you can pretty quickly start to see those trends. There's a lot of seasonality too. We know that certain times of the year, cows they have no interest in the free choice mineral. And in other times of the year, they've got nothing better to do. Still have a lot of things to learn about what drives all of those, but salt and how close it is to the water are probably the two big things.
All right. So I addressed the question of giving multi-min when you would give it. How about for organic mineral? So if I regularly feed organic mineral and I'm willing to have the initial cost of organic mineral throughout 6 months of the year, which 6 months would be better for me to give that? Or what time period would it be better for me to give organic mineral to my herd?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing I would say is that there's very few incidences where you would want to have all of your trace mineral come from organic sources, right? Like you probably just don't need to go that far, but having say 25 or 30% of it or some percentage of it has multiple benefits. One, you should be able to reduce your supplementation in general because you're now providing a more bioavailable source of say copper or zinc. If I had to pick 6 months of the year, well, so first of all, let me just take the time to say, we don't want to be one of those yo-yo things where it's like no mineral for, a month and then all mineral for a month. That's not really the way that the cows are designed. So we want to try to have some consistent offerings in front of them. Maybe what's in that offering changes seasonally, but try to have some sort of consistent offering. If I had to pick, I'm still going to pick that window of calving and breed up, right? So if I had to pick, I would say, the last 3 months of gestation and the first 3 months of lactation, because we're going to catch lactation, we're going to catch calf health, and we're going to catch, synchronization and breed up there at, kind of her most stressful time period.
Sounds good. One question from a producer, he's asking about, the option of when you can have a custom mineral put together for your needs and the cost associated with that versus just picking one up off the shelf. It's already been put together. Do you feel that there is a break-even analysis on how many cattle you need to have before you go that route of having a custom mineral, or do you think producers should, start off with ensuring that they have a custom mineral to be sure that their cows are getting exactly what they need?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I just run a few cows at my place, so I'm at the mercy of, the farm store, right, for whatever mineral I happen to be able to pick up. Although it is really funny when somebody comes up to me and it's like, ma'am, can I help you understand the mineral? And I'm just like, nah, I got this. But I do think that small producers can think about others who are in the area, because if you have geographical differences, it's likely that others in your area are probably in a pretty similar boat. So you could consider going together to buy custom mineral if you need a bulk, limit. Even my feed mill here, where I get bagged feed and stuff put up in the winter, are willing to make me a custom mineral. And I've talked to them before about making a supplement and stuff, and they didn't really have limits on it. I'm sure that there are break-evens associated with some of that, maybe when it comes to hauling and stuff, but man, custom minerals are so much cheaper in general than, some of the stuff, because you just have all the markup from the farm store. And sometimes there's other additives and things in there that maybe you don't really need. That's a great opportunity to talk to your extension folks, because they can help you with that kind of stuff.
Awesome. Thank you. So if I'm a producer that is really wanting to get away from feeding free choice mineral, and it's just not possible for me to feed mineral in a feed stuff or a TMR, could I give multi-min twice a year, or how many times a year would I need to give multi-min to be able to get away from that? Would that work even?
Yeah, so I would not recommend it, and it's not because multi-min's not a good product. I would not recommend it because there are lots of minerals outside of the 4 minerals that are in multi-min, right? And the cow is actually really uniquely capable of using these 4 minerals, kind of storing them and using them for later. But things like cobalt and iodine that are going to be in that mineral, or phosphorus, depending where you are regionally, or magnesium, I always shy away from the idea of trying to only go to an injection or only go into a bolus or something and completely abandoning the free choice mineral. However, I completely understand in places like with range cows and others, sometimes the logistics just do not work. And so Idaho, I'll just pick on Idaho. So we said it was a lot of molybdenum in the forages. There's obviously a lot of range territory there. To me, that seems like a great place to try to use multi-min before cows get kicked out to range. to try to bulk up things like their copper status before they're about to get pulled down with some of that. Whenever possible, try to get mineral out in front of them, but I understand the logistics, and that's not always feasible.
All right. So sticking with multi-min, is it beneficial for us to give multi-min to calves at initial vaccination as well as when they're given their booster shot 6 to 8 weeks later?
I would not give 2 injections quite that close together. I realize they're relatively small injections when the animals are that small, but I really do like the 90-day window between injections if you're going to do anything, just because if you do have any animals that are on the higher side, you don't want to risk overaccumulation. Our speaker at the end of this series knows way more about that. I do not play an immunologist or a vet on TV, so I'm not qualified to really answer that, but I know they've seen some cool stuff with antibody titers and some other responses when given in conjunction. So I would encourage the person who asked the question to tune in for that one, because I think Dr. Palmeiras will give a nice talk on all kinds of fun things with immunity.
All right, I'll get do about 2 or 3 more questions, and then we'll call it a night. When we check for mineral in the liver biopsies, does it matter the age of the animal? When should we probably do those? When they're before they go out on grass, when they come off of grass? When's the best time?
Well, that's a great question. I'll give you a teacher's answer, which is it depends on your purpose. So so a couple of situations. So I would, like, if you had a relatively young calf, anything less than 6 months of age, I wouldn't mess around with biopsies on them, in part because you may not have the right facilities to be able to restrain them safely and stuff, the way like we have some nice squeeze chutes and stuff. In that really young animal, liver mineral is going to be sky high, right? Because he picked it up during gestation. That's a great point to keep in mind, that when you're working with your vet or others to decide if you've got issues, make sure you're looking at the right reference ranges, or that they are, because newborns, for example, what's normal for them for liver copper is going to be toxic for an adult, and it's totally normal for that baby. So you want to make sure you're looking at the right reference ranges. I think animals around weaning, so 6 or 7 months of age, that's not a bad idea. And it's a good idea, because usually they're coming off of grass or something before they go to the feedlot or something at that point, or go to a stalker. If I was thinking about cows, I kind of like the preg check time, because again, it's kind of the end of the fall where she should have sort of gotten a little bit of a top up on things. It's really the winter rations that usually put a hurting on our mineral status in the cow herd, right? Because we've got poor vitamin quality, we've got harvested hays, we've got, ensiled feedstuffs. We may not always have a nice way to force it into the TMR, so we've got inconsistent intakes. So I kind of like that, preg check, see where she's at going into the fall or winter.
All right. And then what kind of mineral concerns might we need to watch out for when we're managing different forages like annuals, perennials, or legumes? Is there a difference, or you just got to sample them?
There are some differences. So some grasses, and it's not quite as clean as just warm versus cool season, but some grasses, for example, are selenium accumulators. And so those plants will actually accumulate selenium. So you got to be pretty cautious about whether you, say, fertilize with something like that. Others, so some things like calcium or legumes, for example, I don't think they get as much potassium in the spring as grasses do. So if you've got some clover in your mix in your spring pasture, you maybe won't run into as many concerns with grass tetany because your potassium is not quite as high because of the clover. So there definitely are some species differences in terms of their mineral content.
All right. And then one question you started to touch on a little bit. I believe it was around zinc and copper and how they can affect each other. And if I know it correctly, I believe too much zinc can decrease the amount of copper. Is that right? That's absorbed?
Yeah. So you're thinking about like the zinc copper ratio that we sometimes hear about?
Yep. So what ratio would that be? How much zinc is too much where it's going to start hurting our copper absorption?
Yeah. I always, the zinc copper ratio, I don't know where that thing came from, but it's a myth that, yeah. So in the cow herd, I think that zinc and copper need to be considered together because that's an animal who's got some longevity. She's going to be around for a while. So, you know, if you're going to feed 100 parts per million of zinc for whatever reason, I still think the NRC at 10 parts per million of zinc is fine. I just don't think those cows and others need to have 20 parts per million of zinc. I mean, the dairy industry has gotten themselves into trouble by feeding 40 parts per million of zinc. In the beef feedlot animal, I just don't think it's a big issue. When we feed more zinc, we do see that liver copper decreases a bit, but they're usually still normal. And as long as they weren't copper deficient the day they walked into the yard, I'm just not too worried about it. I think if we feed NRC copper and we feed, you know, higher amounts of zinc, we're still perfectly fine. I think we see more problems when we feed too much copper. And I know that there's this idea of like, well, 3-to-1 for zinc to copper. So if I go to 90 of zinc, now I need to have, you know, 20 or 30 of copper. And those are just, they're relatively high for copper. I'd rather see NRC for copper at 10 and maybe zinc, you know, at, say, if you did go to like 90 or something for whatever reason. I don't know if we need 90 in the cow herd. Probably 60 is fine.
All right. Well, just for those of us that missed it, what was the percentage of trace minerals that are actually absorbed again?
So relatively low amounts. So anywhere from 5%, so say for something like copper, to like maybe 20 to 25% for something like zinc.
All right. Well, thank you very much for answering our questions. We greatly appreciate it. I'd like to remind everyone that this webinar was recorded. So if you're like me and wasn't able to scribble down notes fast enough, we will have the recording posted tomorrow afternoon so that you can go back and watch it. I'll also be sure to include that link that Dr. Hansen provided us to the Extension Missouri website in the description of the video so that you can find it. I would like to invite you to come back and join us next week at the same time, Wednesday, 7 p.m. Central, where we will be reading between the lines with mineral tags and discussing consumption and how to manage that as well. This is just the first of our 4-part series. We will get into more in depth on reproduction as well as immune system and vaccine response when it comes to feeding trace minerals or using multi-min. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, Dr. Hansen, for joining us. And you all have a great evening.